Well, good afternoon or evening. Wow. Good evening.
Good evening.
All right, that's awesome. That's awesome. Get some life in these veins. So just a little bit about myself, just a little more. Again, work with a company called Leading Agile. Company we've been around for about 7 years. A friend of mine started the company, and we just enjoy helping companies out, doing some great things. Had a lot of growth here in the last few years, so it's been awesome. It's been a fun ride. Jokingly, I used to say I had hair when I started, but I can't really say that. My experience, I grew up as a developer. Most of my years have been in the financial services space, but I've worked with different companies through the years as well. And of course, being with Leading Agile almost 6 years, a lot of interesting companies we've worked with, so a lot of different domains out there. It's been a lot of fun. So here's some of the things I think we'll talk about tonight. Let's see if you think this is a good set of topics. So we want to talk about portfolio management in a way that allows us to focus upon the most valuable things we can do for our company, what we're trying to achieve. Balancing our capacity against demand. Do you guys ever find that the business is asking to do more than you guys have capacity to do? Is that a problem? Yeah, it's crazy. How to be adaptive and support continuous improvement. So how do we do that as an organization? How do we create the systems that allow us to do that? And then how do we support, how many of you are in really large organizations? We tend to, from an Agile perspective, it becomes difficult to support some of the corporate compliance things that we have to deal with. Security issues, regulatory things. So we want to talk about how do we work that into our portfolio management system to be able to support that. Make sense? You guys think this is a good set of topics for us to go through tonight? Okay, awesome. The other thing is I want it to be interactive, so feel free to stop me, ask questions. If you think I said something you think I'm full of it, that's okay too. We can have that conversation. If we end up tonight just me talking all night, it's not going to be fun for you guys. Let's make it interactive, okay? All right, so this is the traditional PMI definition of portfolio management. I'm not going to read all of these words, but I think most of us that have been around for a while, this is probably what we grew up with from a portfolio management perspective. Does that make sense? It may not resonate with you, but that's the definition that a lot of us are aware of. Okay. There's another definition I found, Investopedia's definition. It actually is in more alignment, I think, with what we're trying to do from an iterative development perspective. So they're saying portfolio management is the art and science of making decisions about investment mix and policy, matching investments to objectives, asset allocation for individuals and institutions, balancing risk against performance. That one resonates with me better than the other one. How about you guys?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. All right. So before we talk about portfolio management, I want to set some context about what Rick believes Agile is. And so that will inform our discussion about portfolio management when we're operating in an Agile world. Is that fair to do that? Okay. So there's kind of three things we want to talk about. And the first is, Agile is about creating teams, cross-functional teams that have everything necessary for them to complete the work that we're asking them to do. Does that make sense? And those of you, how many of you in this room are doing Agile today? Is that how you would define Agile teams? Okay. I always say teams that stay together until death do us part. Right? Then we have teams, we also have to provide backlogs. And backlogs are the things that we're asking our teams to go do, to build. Okay? So we have teams, we have backlogs, and then we want to demonstrate working tested software. So incrementally, iteratively getting feedback, be able to demonstrate software that's actually working and people can see it, touch it and feel it. Is that cool? Okay? So why is this important? So it's important from the standpoint of having teams that stay together, having backlog, and they're accountable for doing their work. But they're accountable for doing their work because we've created clarity in the backlog for those teams. A lot of times you find Agile teams that are suffering because they don't have the clarity they need about what they're supposed to build. They're working, they're doing stuff, but we don't necessarily have the clarity necessary for them to be building the most important things for the organization. And portfolio management is going to help us with that. I'll talk about that in just a moment. Then if we have provided that clarity for those teams, then the teams are accountable for doing the work. Do what you say you're going to do. If the team agreed we're going to do these 10 things during this time period, then they've made that commitment. They need to do those 10 things, right? Clarity, accountability, and then measurable progress. We have to have the ability to determine if we're making progress towards some goal. And can we measure that? Okay? And so if we have this, clarity, accountability, measurable progress, we have a system of delivery that allows us to focus on value and deliver things out to our customers. Yeah?
Just a quick question. Will this deck be available?
Yes. Yeah, I'll make sure this deck is available. Maria, I'll just send. Yeah, I'll get it to you. Yep. So how do we scale this? And this is where we start to get into portfolio management. So you think about, we have backlogs, clarity of those backlogs, governance for me, because governance, when you hear that word, sometimes we feel like it's a big bureaucratic thing. When we think about governance, it's lightweight. It's making sure we're doing the right things. And it allows us to create clarity in the backlog for our teams. So the way, a lot of times I think about it from the standpoint of governance is, how does the rest of the organization operate in a way that we're making the best decisions in what to build and how to build that by our teams. Then we have structure. So when you build teams around something, we want those teams to stay together. And so one of the things we do is define the structure of those teams. And that can be difficult. Sometimes when we go in and do transformation with organizations, we change the structure a good bit, depending upon input from an architectural perspective, maybe lines of business, what are your capabilities from a business standpoint. And so creating the structure is important, because that structure is what the governance model flows across to allow us to create value. And then finally we have metrics. And the metrics allow us to demonstrate to ourselves that we are indeed providing value. And we should be able to tie that back to our company's strategy. And those metrics come from two places, at least for us when we're doing transformations. There's metrics around the system's ability to deliver value, and those metrics would stay in place forever. And then there's metrics around the change. So if you're moving from, let's say, a waterfall approach to an agile approach, there's certain metrics we can pay attention to make sure we're actually making progress on that journey as well. So there's two sets of metrics that I might pay attention to. Is that cool?
Touch on those? Are you going to touch on those?
I'm going to hit them really fast. We're not going to go in a lot of detail on them, but we are going to talk about governance, structure, metrics here next. So let's talk about structure. So this is a multi-tiered model, and this is a common pattern that we use when we do transformations in organizations. And so that the bottom tier would be some number of delivery teams. So these are your scrum teams typically that are cross-functional, have everything necessary to do the work we've asked them to do. They stay together, they have a backlog, and they're demonstrating measurable progress through working tests of software. And that structure you could have teams that are feature teams, product teams, maybe they're services teams. You may have a mixture of those. Before my leading Agile days, I worked in financial services, and we had teams that were focused on banking platforms, bill payment platforms, but then we had all of these services teams that had particular services domain that they were focused on. And they provided capabilities that the product teams used. Do you guys have any of that in your organization? Those types of teams? Yep. Okay. Then above that is something we call program teams. Some organizations might call these product teams. It's also a team that's cross-functional, but it's the team that's making sure that we're creating clarity in the backlog for these teams. They are creating the requirements, they're creating the backlog, they're providing that direction. They're making decisions about the minimal thing we can do to make sure we're getting the outcomes the business has asked us for. So making sure we're building the right thing. We don't want to overbill. We want to build the right thing to demonstrate success. Does that make sense? And then at the top level are portfolio teams. So portfolio teams are really, what's our investment mix look like? Where should we place our bets? What's the next and most important thing for our company to do? And oftentimes there may be a tier above this called a strategy tier. And that strategy tier is thinking about 5, 6, 10, 15 years out. What's the strategy for the company? And so if you have that strategy, then the test for the portfolio team, are we picking the right things to execute on that allow us to support that strategy? If we can't demonstrate that, then why are we doing this thing, right? That helps us have a lot of clarity about the things we choose to do or those things we choose not to do. Any questions about this structure?
How would the structure work when you have, excuse me, say the bottom delivery team has to work with another intermediate team
Yep.
who then, say, like sells a product to the end user.
Yep.
So you have these layers of different responsibilities, and by the time that you, even you working with proxy users, come to find out that what you're building isn't really what they wanted.
Yeah, so it depends upon the organization, right? There's not a one answer that's going to solve that problem, but there's a couple of things of what you said. So one is making sure the program team has the voice of the customer in some way. Maybe that customer's not interacting with the Scrum teams every single day, but there's at least some relationship that we can provide feedback. I mean, I have organizations that we have the program team that's providing feedback to the delivery teams every single day, and then maybe they're doing feature level feedback out to the end customer on a larger cadence. But we're still getting that feedback. We're not waiting 6 months before we get feedback and find out we've not built the right thing. So we want to accelerate that. The other thing that I heard in there is dependencies. I mean, almost every organization that we work with, there are dependencies. You know, this team can't do something unless this team does something first. Or this team can't do something until these 3 teams build some new service capability. One of the responsibilities of this program tier is to make sure we're managing those dependencies. And frankly, if you're in an organization that has a lot of legacy architecture, a lot of dependencies, traditional project management that we all do still exist. You just have to manage the heck out of this stuff, right? Because pure Agile teams are not autonomous in most organizations. If they are, then you don't have to have that management overhead. An Agile team that's completely autonomous, that has no architectural dependencies or other team dependencies, they can do whatever they want, right? You don't have to have that overhead. That's just not the nature of the companies that we're working in. So we build the system to allow us to manage that. And we'll get into a little of the detail behind that when we get into the governance model. I don't know if that helped or not, but.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one of those things where you really have to dig in a little deeper to find out what the specifics are. But there's some patterns, right?
And maybe Mike said gave something on how starting off doing slices.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Prove it out.
Yeah, that's right. So when we do transformations, we don't come in and boil the ocean. We'll find a slice of the organization. So but it's a full stack. It's portfolio, it's program, it's delivery team. So it may be, you know, one portfolio team, one program team, and maybe 3 or 4 delivery teams. And you do that slice to make sure we understand all the problems that exist in the organization. And once we've demonstrated success, then let's start to roll that out. Okay. All right. So let's talk about governance. And so, again, governance is the flow of work across the system, the structure. And so typically at the delivery teams, we're talking about Scrum. That's how work is managed. At the program team and the portfolio team, it's more flow-based. We're using Kanban, and it's about the flow of value through the system. And we'll talk a bit more about that here in a minute when we get into the details of governance. Okay? Then let's talk about metrics. And so at the delivery team level, this is a set of metrics that we typically pay attention to, okay? So things like backlog size. How deep is my backlog? Made me think of that song, How Deep Is Our Love? How deep is my backlog? And we want to make sure it's sufficient depth, not to starve the teams, but also pushed far enough ahead to manage dependencies. So if you have a lot of dependencies, that depth of your backlog, maybe 3 or 4 sprints. If you don't have dependencies, maybe it's smaller. You can become more adaptable. Velocity, the throughput of the team. How much can a team demonstrate, how much working tested software that can they build on a cadence to every single sprint? Burn down, are they burning down toward the goals that we set when we did our planning? Escape defects. Are we finding defects from work we did in prior sprints? Commitment ratio, acceptance ratio. Are we doing what we said we're going to do? You guys said you're going to do these 10 things in the backlog, you only did 8. That's 80%, right? What's the right number there? We want to measure that. And then scope change. How much churn is happening? We want to measure that. Because churn at this level may indicate problems above. We're not pushing our planning horizon out far enough. We're not thinking through this. We're not managing risk and dependencies well.
So if they commit to a certain percentage and you see a trend,
Yep.
you're like, okay, so their number for that run is going to be adjusted downward or to wherever it needs to be? Or are you going to just try to, I mean, if you're going to keep hitting 80%?
Yeah, so there's a trend here. So when we set up dashboards, there's a couple of things we're paying attention to. When is it under control? So that commitment ratio typically is 80%. As long as we're 80%, we're thumbs up. If it gets below that, we need to go find out why that's happening. And then what's the trend? You know, are you trending up as far as your commitment or down? We want to pay attention to that. Velocity is the same thing. I don't care what your velocity is. I just want it to be consistent, right? If it's, you know, this number, this sprint, it's this number, the next sprint, that number, that you can't be predictable. That's not a stable system, right? We want to make sure that we have stability in our delivery system. Okay. So at the program team level, just a handful of things we pay attention to, particularly in the beginning. Cycle time, and we're thinking about features. You know, how fast are we getting features into the market? What's that cycle time? And one of the things we want to do over time is reduce that, because as we reduce the cycle time, we actually improve the throughput of the organization. You can deliver more value by operating in smaller batches. So cycle time can be important. The number of features blocked. So we may have features that are hung up because something down here is blocked. We need to go find out why that's happening. Why are these features not getting out? What could we have done? Maybe it's a planning issue. Maybe it's a requirements issue. What could we have done to make sure those things don't happen in the future? And then rework and defects. That's kind of a traditional metric there. And then at the portfolio level, similar things. Cycle time, your traditional project management, time, cost, scope, those types of things. And ROI and capitalization. Are we capitalizing appropriately? Are we getting the business benefit that we expect? I mean, one of the things that we pay a lot of attention to at this tier, and I'm going to talk about the thing that we pay attention to here called an EPIC, is does it have a business case? Can we demonstrate that there's value in the thing that we're doing? If we can't, why are we doing it? Okay? Any questions?
So there's, in the bi-directional communication that occurs from portfolio to delivery.
Yep.
I've seen sometimes where they're asking for some of the things that you described that would be more appropriate at the team level. Mm-hmm. How do you feel about it?
So it's like, think about your car. If you're driving down the road, we don't have 1,000 gauges. You know, there's a port up under the dash that a mechanic can hook into to get all manner of details about your car. If I'm driving my car, is that something I should be paying attention to? No. Maybe I want to have someone pay attention to it if the lights on the dash turn red. I've got an issue. So we want to make sure the right metrics are being paid attention to at the right level. Now, if we find that our cycle time or we've got metrics at the program tier are going south on us, then by all means, let's go drop down and investigate that. But for people at a higher tier focusing on some of these metrics, it's just a waste of time. Doesn't make sense. That's not what we should be paying attention to. Make sense? Okay.
They still ask for it, though.
I know. Well, part of it's trust, right?
Yeah.
Because we're demonstrating a new approach to delivering value. And they want to put their hands on the things that they can see and touch, which are some of those metrics. We need to shift that thinking to the appropriate metrics to pay attention to. Governance flow. Talk about the things that flow first. So in the requirements decomposition model that we traditionally use, we talk about epics to features to stories. Unfortunately, in the Agile world, epics are, that's an overloaded term. In some camps, an epic is just a big story that needs to be further decomposed. But in the definition that we use, an epic is some business problem or opportunity that we need to go do something about. Okay? Those are further decomposed into capabilities we intend to build, features. And then those features are further decomposed into stories. And the stories are the things that show up in the backlog for our teams. We cool with that? Okay. So let's.
You got 3 to 5 days there on the stores?
1, 2, 3, 5, no more than 5. But yeah, so it's interesting, right? When you come into organizations that are very complex, a lot of dependencies, those stories tend to be too big. And it takes time to get them down to the appropriate level of size.
Well, it seemed pure to say, anything more than half a day or a day,
Yeah.
that meets definition of done.
Then they're working in a world that's fictional. All right. So here are the key goals from portfolio management. So now we're back to the topic of the night. And so the governance model will support our ability to accomplish these goals over time. So the first is strategic alignment, making sure that the things that we're determining, or the things that we're choosing to do, invest in, do actually match up with our strategy from a company's perspective, okay? We also want to make sure that there's transparency in the organization. We understand how the system of delivery is performing so we can make better decisions about what to invest in. And then again, build the things that are valuable. Stop building the things that don't have value. There's a study that a lot of people have used called the Chaos Report that showed in this set of software that was surveyed, 64% of features rarely or never used. Why did we build it? Right? It's there. It's now that's software that we can't break in the future. We have to continue testing it and support it, but no one uses it. Terrible. Terrible. Demand management. So making sure that we understand the capacity of the organization and we're able to leverage that capacity to create value. How do we improve the predictability of the organization so we can make better promises into the market? Okay? How do we manage our dependencies? How do we manage risk? Making sure that we're focused on that. Then detailed planning. At some point we have to get down to the level of specifics about what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, who's involved, what teams are involved. So that level of planning has to occur at some point. Execution governance. So now we're going to build the thing. We're making it happen. We're demonstrating working tested software frequently. We're getting feedback. So we want to support that ability from a portfolio management perspective. Say you get into execution and we find that some dependencies outside of our control are no longer able to meet their commitments to us. Maybe we need to escalate that out to the organization. And then measuring effectiveness. And this is something a lot of organizations have trouble with. We've done it, we had a business case, but we never did go check to make sure it did what we thought it did. We want to make sure we validate that assumption in that business case. Okay? So this is a flow. And so again, thinking about that structure, we have the portfolio tier, the program tier, and the delivery team tier. And so this is just a flow. It looks like it's a lot, but it's pretty simple. Epics are flowing from left to right, so think of it as a life cycle for the epic. Features are flowing from left to right. Similarly, stories. And this is just Scrum's life cycle, so we're not going to talk about that. But you think about portfolio management, things are coming in, and we have to make a decision to move it forward or not. We may kill it, we may reduce its scope, or we may choose to go do it. And we want to do just enough to make that decision. So here, we're not going to go spend a month doing detailed planning. We're going to validate the business case, our assumptions. We're going to move it over here to determine maybe how we're going to technically solve the problem at a high level. Again, we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. Is it even viable? Can we technically solve this problem? And so we continue to refine that epic as it moves from left to right. That make sense? Okay. Each step has very clear objectives, outcomes, and later in the deck I'll show you a slide that has a lot of specifics around the activities that are happening, a RACI, who's involved typically, those types of things. Okay? And at any step in the journey, we can say we're not going to do it. We may have said, you know what, this thing seems to support our strategy, it seems to have a good business case. But we get in here and we understand how we're actually going to solve it. Maybe the cost now of doing it is so high, it no longer has a business case. Kill it. It's easier when you have a model like this, because what the problem we have sometimes is if you've got an organization that spends months trying to figure something out, you've invested that time and effort, and we can't let it go. Even though everybody knows it's not the right thing to do. Okay? Any questions? Okay, cool. All right, so I'm not going to go through all the details. Again, this deck will be available to you guys, but it just demonstrates that there's a planting onion. You know, at the highest level, we're thinking about our strategy. The strategy sets the context for the decisions we're making at the portfolio tier. The portfolio tier sets the context for decisions we're making at the program tier. On and on and on and on, right? And that context is important. A lot of times you'll go into an organization, you'll talk to a team, and the team can tell you everything about their backlog, what they're building. Why are you doing it? Don't know. It's in the backlog, we're told to do it. How is this affecting your company's strategy? How's it changing things? They can't answer that question. So this sets the context. I want our teams to understand all the way back up to why are we doing it? Because typically we create delivery teams that have smart people in them, that have been building software and solving problems their whole career. Let's let them understand why we're doing it, because oftentimes they can help us create a better solution. Is that fair? Yeah, okay. So some of the artifacts that we think about from a portfolio management perspective. Now some of these may, if you're using some Agile tooling, like Rally or version 1, something like that, some of these things might be replaced by that tooling. Epic brief, so that is just a very lightweight description of the epic. We'll talk more about that here in a moment. That's the thing that's moving from left to right at the portfolio tier. Okay. Then portfolio planning sheet, that's some type of sheet that we're using in our portfolio management meeting to help us do decisioning. Maybe there's some prioritization data in that spreadsheet as well. An epic roadmap, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that's just a vision of where we're headed, 12, 16, 18, 24 months, whatever that might look like. Some kind of dashboard to make sure that we understand the system of delivery is operating in a way that we expect. And so if the dashboard turns red, we know we need to go do something about that. And release plans. A credible plan based upon a predictable organization that allows us to make promises to our customers. Okay? Good? All right. So let's talk about strategic alignment. And so when we think about strategic alignment, we're making sure that that epic aligns to our strategy. And some of the activities that we're doing there is making sure from an intake that we're validating that the thing that we're determining to do or deciding to do actually does align with our strategy. Making sure if we have a business architecture, making sure it fits within that. And then anything that doesn't align, we're going to defer or maybe just kill. And then at this point, we've got an epic brief that's been initiated. And we only have epics in the backlog at the portfolio tier that align to our strategy. Okay? So this is some of the stuff that you might see in an epic brief. So a name, the name of the epic, who owns it, is there an investment theme or maybe some strategic theme that we want to tie it back down. Maybe there's some value statement. A lot of times, the organizations we work with will do a problem statement. And typically it's of the form, the problem of, affects, who's affected, the impact of that is, and then a successful solution would. Very distinct, very succinct, very crisp. It really helps demonstrate the problem that we're trying to solve. I find it to be just really valuable to our teams. Maybe there's some features and benefits. We want to make sure that we start to understand our dependencies and risk and assumptions. We probably don't have all of this clearly defined at this point, but we will at some. And then what do we think the opportunity case? And typically that's a product management function that we build out. Get into demand management, solution definition. So this is where we're going to validate that we actually can go solve this problem. So maybe the problem statement is around creating levitating automobiles. Well, we don't have technology to do levitation. So that's not viable. We can't do it. Go kill it. right? So we want to make sure that we can viably create a solution that solves this problem. So we want to validate that. We want to identify work around risk and dependencies. So this early on, we want to start to frame up what those dependencies are. Because a bank I worked with one time, they had 17 different parts of the organization they potentially had dependencies with. And those areas were outside of their control. And one of those areas had a lead time of 9 months. So if I was doing something in the next release and I needed their assistance, forget it. It's not going to happen. So we want to start to, and those are constraints, right? And if you have those constraints, we need to start thinking about those dependencies much farther back than you would like. Okay, so we've got our epic brief, we've got some constraints filled out, we've probably have some features defined, and we've got some architectural and risk information now at this point. We also probably have updated our weighted shortest job first, and I'm going to talk about prioritization in a minute, so I'll give you a definition of what this means, okay? All right, so from an epic brief, we're continuing to fill this information out. So again, we're progressively filling this out over time. We're not saying, how often do you guys find that if somebody creates templates for you to fill out, and we just say, oh, well, here's a template. I need to fill out everything in the template. And that's what we do, right? So yes, there's a template here, but we want to be very prescriptive about how much we need to fill out today versus what we need to fill out tomorrow. We don't have to do it all. We just need to fill out the information today to allow us to make the next responsible decision. Is that cool? Okay. Detail planning. So this is where we're really starting to get into the details of what this thing looks like. At this point, we've defined features, we've estimated, we've got backlog items created, we've got a really good understanding of our risk and dependencies, and this is input into building out our release plans. We probably revisit our roadmap based upon what we've learned, because some things may be bigger, some things may be smaller than we thought. We're updating our plans from a portfolio standpoint. So there's just a tremendous amount of work going on in the organization. And this work is happening all the way down to the delivery teams, potentially. So the program team primarily is responsible for these activities and the things that are happening here, but they have to go reach out to our delivery teams to get them to assist. The delivery teams are estimating, they're providing feedback. They're providing, well, you know what, we could build this in this different way and it would take us less time. Okay, let's go do that. So it's a very collaborative environment in which we're doing this.
So, question. If this is on the portfolio level, and you got to get information, feedback from the delivery teams, and the delivery teams are working feverishly to get their goal.
Yep.
Is this data mining, is this going to be during the PI or the IP sessions or during that?
So think about, we're doing a continuous flow, right? And so there's some collaboration, requests for information from our delivery teams going on all the time. And so, I mean, typically what we see, our delivery teams spend about 10% of their time, and I don't leave the room say Rick said, but about 10% of their time supporting the program tier and above. Either in supporting them to create ready backlog for upcoming sprints or helping answer these questions. But part of the trick here is to make sure we build a program team that has most of the skills necessary to do this. Because at this point, once we get into detailed planning, we have to have our delivery teams represented, right? But those earlier stages, I should have sufficient skills on the program team to answer those questions. I shouldn't have to go bug the delivery teams all the time. But you might.
Structure,
Pardon?
like architecture.
Yeah, that's right. The program team typically has, product representation, BAs, architecture, or an architect. Maybe technical leads are participating from time to time. It's just what's that right structure to make sure that they can accomplish those activities, those outcomes. Yes?
Can you talk just briefly about, like, at the epic level, when they're, like, the team is trying, they already pretty much know what they want to work on, but what does that ceremony look like when they're, like, doing some of that data gathering, and who do they usually bring in on that?
The program team, or?
Yeah. Like, what does that typically look like?
Yeah, so there's usually a cadence of the program team. So just like portfolio teams have a cadence of meetings, Some organizations I work with meet every 2 weeks, sometimes once a month, just depends upon the organization. Program teams have a much faster cycle of meeting and working together. And there's certain sessions, there's certain meetings set up to go do these things. And so out of that, they may say, well, you know what, we don't know, what our dependencies are in this area of the system. We need to go talk to one of these delivery teams to get some input. And so that would be an action item they would take, and they would go do that. So they're managing that work, and then they're interacting with delivery teams and external entities, because we want to bring in, if you've got dependencies for parts of your organization outside of your control, they need to be brought in to have these conversations as well. A company I work with on the program team had representation from the organization that was responsible for deployment and the operations of the systems. And so there was someone on that program team that represented that area, that they didn't go to all the meetings, but there were certain meetings they had to be in, because we had to have their input and also give them visibility of what's coming. I don't know if that helped. But.
So is that like, are they doing backlog grooming at that point with the rest of the team, and then they're refining the backlog?
Yeah, so there's different focuses, right? So there's focus on, so let's go back into so let's say that our epics are here. So there's probably some session where we're just getting the epic brief pulled together, collecting our thoughts, and getting ready to see if it aligns with strategy. Maybe there's something going on to understand if we can go build it. What's the solution look like? So how do we go do that? So there's different outcomes that we're after. And so I wouldn't say you've got this big meeting, we're trying to do all of this. You want to have very focused meetings aligning with these outcomes. Okay? All right. Okay. So we get into execution governance. So at this point, we're building this stuff. We've got a release plan. The teams are working within that release plan and their commitments that they're making, and we're assessing our progress. It's monitoring the system at this point. It's traditional project management stuff. But even here, I mean, if we find that there are things that we've learned that we shouldn't be doing, it's okay to kill it here too, right? That's difficult for some people, but we should have that option as well, okay? What are the different types of prioritization you guys use today when you're trying to decide what to work on? Anybody? Somebody else?
Profitability and impact.
What's that?
Profitability and impact.
Profitability and impact?
ROI.
ROI?
Risk.
Risk?
Preparation, you've got to do something here to be able to get bigger return on investment later. You have to do the...
Okay, earlier investment. So that's interesting. I want to come back to that when we get into road mapping. Okay. So I'm going to talk about a couple of different prioritization techniques. So this one's been around forever. Moscow, right? So must have, should have, could have, won't have. The reason I'm bringing this up is that in a moment I'm going to show you an approach to road mapping at a high level, at that epic level, that can leverage this. And I'll say, Rick didn't come up with this. One of my colleagues at Leading Agile did. I saw it and I thought, that is cool. I'm going to pull this into my talk. And he said, go ahead and do it. All right? Good technique. The other technique is cost of delay. How many of you have heard of this? How many use this? Few. Okay. Okay.
Community goals.
So Reinerson, in his book, The Principles of Product Development Flow, said if you only measure one thing, measure cost of delay. Okay? And so the cost of delay is the revenue that can be earned each month that a project's not in market. Right?
Same as opportunity cost, right?
Pardon?
Same as opportunity cost.
Yes. Well, it could be savings of cost, or it could be revenue generation. Right?
Basically, cost of delay means it's an opportunity you have, whether you want to utilize or just let it go. That is the
Right.
that's the risk.
Well, let's talk about this. I'm going to give you a real example. Okay. So making this very simple, I talked about this with a group one time, and they dug into all the details of my calculations. And let's don't do that. It's just high level. So we've got these three features, and we've got a cost of delay calculation. And so each feature has a certain amount of time it's going to take to do. And then each feature also has a dollar amount value. Is that fair? Okay. All right, so now let's go to this page. So this is, we do everything at once. So we're working on all 3 features at the same time. And that's probably, is that the best way to work on things? To start them all? All right? Terrible way, okay? So you don't get anything done until you get to the end, so you have a tremendous amount of cost of delay. So $247,000 lost revenue, okay? So shortest job first. So each job had a certain amount of time it took. So let's work on the shortest one, then the next shortest one, and the next shortest one, okay? And so by doing that, the cost of delay is $175,000. So we've saved money over doing everything at the same time. Do the most valuable first. So that dollar amount, the one that gets us the most revenue, let's do it first. So the cost of delay is $187,000. But if we use the cost of delay calculation, which does feature B first, feature C, then feature A, our cost of delay is only $157,000. Make sense? So a lot of the tooling out there supports this. You can put in the values necessary for it to come up with this prioritization technique for you. Now, what's interesting is, so I worked with a large organization one time, and their tooling didn't support this. So one of my colleagues created this pretty complicated spreadsheet that allowed them to put all the epics in. They were able to create dependencies across other parts of the organization in the spreadsheet and be able to do cost of delay. And so got all this stuff in, pulled it up on the screen, and like, everybody in the room said, well, okay, let's just do that. Well, cost of delay is input in your decisioning, right? Just don't use it to blindly go do something. Use it as input to have a conversation. Because you may choose to order this in a different way. There may be other reasons why you would do that. It's just a technique to help you in your prioritization. Is that good? Okay. So I saw a couple of hands that are using this technique.
Used as, part of the weighted shortest job first.
Yeah.
Cost of delay is a component of
Right.
several
That's right.
factors, yeah.
That's right. Okay. So it's been effective for you guys. Yeah. Okay. Cool. All right. Awesome. All right. So how do you guys understand what your capacity is in your organization today?
Velocity of team.
About teams?
Velocity of
Okay, velocity of teams. What else?
What do you mean by demand management?
So you have a certain amount of capacity in your organization.
It can be, it means in terms of,
how much work versus how many people do you have to?
Yeah, how much work? How do you know how much work you can get done? Right. Let me show you a slide here. All right. There you go. Bing, bing, bing. How many of you have worked in organizations where you tried to create something like this? You put every person in a spreadsheet, all the days or weeks, how many hours they're going to work. Well, Joe's going to be off next Monday. Let's take 8 hours out. Sue's going to be off for a week. Let's take 40 hours out. And that's how you manage your capacity. Do you find that to be effective?
No.
Okay, all right. A lot of people do it. Takes a lot of time. There are managers whose job is this, right? Yeah, right?
At a
Yeah.
high level, annual capacity planning is a pretty
So let's talk about capacity and how we express capacity in a different way. Some options here. So team months. So getting back to your comment about teams. Each team represents capacity. So maybe we're represented in team months or team sprints. How many, how much a team can do per sprint. Team releases or story points. That's another way to express capacity, right? Good with that? Okay. What's necessary for this to happen?
Consistent.
Yeah, consistent. So if we are not stable, if our organization is not stable, then none of these matter, right? Because this implies that we have a predictable organization that can perform at the same level ongoing. So we have to make sure that we build that predictability in. Good with that? But once we've done that, then we can start to make decisions about how we leverage that capacity. How many of you have different investments mixes? You've got different types of work that you do in your organization, and you set out a percentage of certain type of work that you're going to do. How many of you do that in your organization? A few. So maybe certain percentage for break fix work, certain percentage for new product development, things like that. So we can start to do that. So we can start to understand what our investment mixture looks like, and then make sure that we can apply that investment mixture across our teams to meet that need. And depending upon the tooling, we can report upon it. We can make sure that those things are being accomplished across those teams. Okay? All right. How many of you are doing road mapping? So thinking about farther out in the future. Okay, a few hands. How far out? A year? Most people are a year? Yeah, okay. A quarter? By quarter? How many of you have a process in your company where you do annual planning? Yeah. I'll talk about that in a minute. So road mapping. So road mapping gives us the ability to think farther out into the future about the things we may do. And so we don't have to spend a tremendous amount of time getting the detail for stuff that we're doing 12 months from now, but they're big rocks. That's where we're headed, but everybody has an alignment about where we're headed. We have a lot of detail on the things that are upcoming. We have less detail as we move to the right, but they're directionally sound. One of the reasons this is important, it ties back to something you said, is that let's say that this big rock requires some capability in an organization or maybe technologies that we just don't have. So for us to do that, we need to make some investments back here to allow ourselves to be set up for success here. And so that road mapping helps. It really helps from an architectural perspective, because it allows us to create better architectural roadmaps, build the right things for the future because we know what's coming. It also allows us to manage our dependencies better. If we know some of these big rocks are dependent upon different parts of the organization that have long lead times, then we can start to get ahead of that. That make sense? Okay. Some of the organizations I've worked with, they do annual planning, and it's a painful process. They get into the September maybe time period, and all the doors go closed. People are in rooms, conference rooms. We're laying out everything we're going to do for the next 12 months. And it's painful. And I was in a meeting with a group one time, and they were just agonizing over this. And I said, look, guys, I said, you want to be directionally correct. You don't have to have all the details. And let me ask you a question. So you did this a year ago. Looking back upon what you accomplished this year, how closely did that align with that original roadmap? And they said, well, it didn't. Well, of course it didn't. It's directionally appropriate, but we know we will adapt and change over time. Right? And so what we do a lot of times is work with the organization to do quarterly planning. And so this roadmap gets updated every quarter, maybe every month, but typically every quarter. So then when you get close to the end of the year and you're doing your annual planning, you just have to add the next quarter, right? It becomes a less painful process. Okay. So this is the sequence of slides which I want to talk about Moscow. So this roadmap is rolling ahead so many quarters. And it represents these epics. And the epics that are closer to us, these are being done, these are being planned, so we know a lot about them. But the rest of these epics are just on the roadmap, right? Directionally, this is where we think we're going. And so then you can start to have these conversations. Well, this is active, so of course it's must-have because we're doing it. This is planned, so these probably are must-have. But then we have some of these different flavors out here as we look at our roadmap, okay? And so let's apply those. And so at this point, what do we know? At this point, we've dropped down away from epics down to features. So we've got must-have features, should have. We know a lot here, don't we? Okay. Do you commit to the could-haves? Let's don't do that. Do you commit to the wish-to-haves? Do you commit to the could-haves? Probably not. What about the must-haves? We can make that commitment, right? Yeah. And so, yes?
You know, there's a Kano model.
Yep.
I might think that you might want to throw in some possible,
Delighters?
yeah,
Yeah.
which might not be your must-have, that you should have.
Yeah, that's right. Well, so Kano model is it's particularly used in product management. We're trying to understand table stakes, the things that you have to have, the things you, and then there's something called delighters. We don't necessarily have to have them, but if we did them, our customers would be just ecstatic, right? And so sometimes we choose to do that. That's not a bad thing to do. So if we have the capacity to pull those things in, I mean, Nikki and I were talking earlier about a situation where you've got some capacity because we know there's unplanned work coming in. And if we have a sequence in which that unplanned work didn't materialize, maybe we can pull in a delighter at that point. Because we've already committed to committed items. We're getting that stuff done. Now we've got some additional capacity to do some of these other items that would be kind of cool for our customer. Okay, so at this point we have a more reliable commitment. Must-have features. We want to realign this, and if we finish early, then what would we do if we finish early here?
You do the should-haves.
Yeah, what do we do to these? Let's start to move those things in, right? And so we're always pushing. We always want to push from right to left. I have to think about that because I'm backwards from you guys. The must-haves to that side. Make sense? And this is a thing that you can do. Just put some cards on a table. You don't have to have a tool. You know, get some sticky notes. Put these things, color code them. Must-have, should-haves, could-haves, and start to rearrange this stuff and have discussions. Because you may have a situation where, well, you know what? I believe this is a must-have. Let's talk about it. Let's have that conversation and realign that. Be very dynamic. It can be pretty fast to do these types of things. Okay. All right. I want to get into some details on the governance model. Remember this picture? This picture is just the flow of epics and features and stories across the organization. The structure of portfolio, program, delivery teams. Okay? So when we work with organizations, this is typically our starting place. And for each one of these blocks, we want to talk about what the objectives are, outcomes, activities, who's involved. So this next slide is going to be way too much information, but it just gives you the level of detail that we can talk about, and this is where I'll touch upon compliance issues. Okay. So this is the detail in the governance model for the portfolio tier. And so for each one of these blocks, life cycle of the epic moving from left to right, we have the purpose. We have activities, the types of things that are happening at this time. So this gets back to your question about meetings that we might want to have because these activities have to happen. Outputs, what's the expected output from this state? And then who's involved? So we've got a RACI at the team level. Okay. And so for intake, we're just making sure these things are initiated, and we want to make sure that at this point it aligns with strategy. That's all we're doing. Okay. But then as we get into solution definition, we want to make sure that we're validating the business case, the viability of our organizations to build it. We want to understand our constraints, start to identify that work. We want to start to understand our risk and dependencies. And so these are some of, this is not a menu that you have to fill out. It's the things that you might do depending upon your organization. But this is a set of things that you might output from this state, right? And then once we made that decision, if the epic moves to the right, we get into release targeting. And so this again gets into the release planning activities that we typically do, right? A lot of detail going on here. At this point, by the time we get into execution, we've got 3 to 4 sprints worth of backlog created for all of our teams. We've got our dependencies managed, we've got risk managed, we've got a risk burn down. All those things are happening. We have a credible release plan that everybody can shake their head and say, yep, thumbs up, we believe we can commit to this. Is that good? Again, just making sure the system of delivery is performing as we expected. And we're meeting our commitment. And then we validate the epic making sure that it does what we expected it to do. So this is where the earlier discussion about getting validation from your customers. If you can bring those customers in to validate, let's do that. There's certainly validation going on at the team level every single sprint, or even more frequently than that. But I would love to have feature level validation going on with our customers as frequently as we possibly can. Right? I've got organizations where they'll do, every 2 sprints, they have a little mini UAT with their customers, and they get feedback from that. Okay? And one of the things we want to make sure at the end we do as well is, here was our business case. It's out. Did we meet that business case? And maybe that's something we can do immediately. Sometimes it takes time. Maybe the business case was a certain amount of revenue uplift over 6 months. Maybe we can't validate that until 6 months later. Maybe we can see some trends, but maybe we can't truly validate it then later. Okay. So similarly to the portfolio tier, same level of detail for the program tier. So this is the life cycle of features. Same thing going on. This is where solution design. Are we able to craft a solution for the problem that we're trying to solve? Are we able to create credible release plans? So all of the stuff that's happening there. And again, we talk about who's involved, who's responsible, who's informed, all the things that we typically do with the RACI chart, right? Making sure that we have clarity there. And this may change depending upon your organization, but it's directionally correct. This is typically what we see in most organizations. Okay?
Rich, can you contrast this with, I don't know if you have any clients using SAFE in terms of the leveling, and some of it looks applicable in that sense, in terms of levels, trains, and...
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So SAFE is a very prescriptive, I'll say that, but that's probably not appropriate, but it's a very well-defined approach for delivering value in certain environments. We find there's some aspects of SAFE that we feel we do, right? There's a lot of this stuff that there's a lot of overlap between what we do and what you see SAFE does. We find that you have to tune your solution for an organization based upon where they are and where they need to go. And so it's not a one-size-fits-all. We need to make it very prescriptive based upon where they are and where they're headed. And so that's where the dynamic is, I think, the difference. Yep.
On the previous slide, I saw retrospectives in the outputs at the portfolio level. I didn't see that at the program level. Why do you do it at one level and not the other? At the portfolio level, how frequently do you do it?
Yeah, it's probably just probably for where this came from, we had in the cadence of meetings for the program team, every month they had a retrospective. So it was less a retrospective at the feature level. It was more, they do a retrospective every month. And so I think for the example that this came from, that just wasn't relevant here.
Okay.
But there's no reason why you couldn't put it there, right? If that's meaningful.
What about the recommendation at the portfolio level?
So what I typically do at the portfolio level is, again, same thing at the program team level. I would do a retrospective every couple of months. It depends upon how frequently they're meeting. If the portfolio team is meeting every couple of weeks, then I might do a retrospective for every month for the first maybe 6 months. But once that portfolio team gets performing well, then maybe the retrospectives happen less frequently. Just depends. Because the retrospective is really helping us create a high-performing portfolio team, right? Okay. Good question. Thank you. And again, I'm not going to go into the delivery tier. Also, you guys have this deck, so and I will share with you the PowerPoint, which will be one talk I did. They wanted a PDF, but the PDF is not very helpful. So you guys can take this PowerPoint and use it as you feel inclined. Okay, so I think we've talked about. Oh, you know what? So as we get into solution design and particularly release planning, but here. So how many of you have organizations that have to do penetration tests, security tests, things like that? Yeah. And so I would want to start to have the conversations about those requirements and needs here. Because typically what happens, we don't do it until we're executing. That's too...
In the program tier.
Yes, the program tier. It's too late here. We want to start to have those conversations. So if we have certain compliance and regulatory requirements and needs, particularly if we have to work with other parts of the organization to make sure that we can pass those, we need to start to frame those conversations up early. Doing it back here is too late. And we specifically, I don't think we have in this example, but a client I work with, we specifically listed out bringing in the security team to do a security review. We don't know a lot yet, but I would rather have a security review that's incomplete here and learn something than too late. Make sense? Okay, all right. So portfolio management focuses on valuable things, balancing capacity against demand, how to be adaptive and support continuous improvement, and then how to support governance, security, audit, and those types of things. And from an audit perspective, it's interesting. I'll hear, well, we have to do X, Y, and Z because audit says we do. Well, that's not true. Audit is just checking to make sure you're doing the things you said you were going to do, right? You're responsible for that. So if you're doing things because audit says you have to do it, but they're no longer providing value, then we need to change what we're saying we're doing. Make sense?
Well, some, wouldn't you say that like federal auditing, pretty much have to?
Well, yeah, but yeah, there's those external audits that you have to do, but a lot of times when internal audit is just making sure we're doing what we say we're going to do, right? And before I joined Leading Agile, my colleague and I at that company, we redid the SAS 70 control objectives. It was just a mess. And we were getting beat up all the time because the things that it said we were supposed to do just wasn't relevant anymore. So just rewrote them. And we were fine at that point because we just redefined what we said we were going to do. And the next time we had an audit, we passed because we did what we said we were going to do. Right? All right, cool. Any questions?
Good question.
Yes.
What about journey mapping? Just curious if anyone here or if you experiment with that.
Mhm.
Is that
Yeah.
successful? Where does that play a role in portfolio management? Where?
Well, typically that's something you would see happening at the program tier. So if you've got product people involved, so typically journey mapping, those types of things, defining your personas. So that's part of the requirements elaboration process. It's part of determining what you need to build, how you're going to build for your customers. So yeah, I would. An organization I had a strong UX organization, and they did a lot of journey mapping, and so that was input as part of the epic definition and feature definition.
Yeah.
So doing it down at the Scrum team level is too late, right? It was input into creating a good backlog for our teams.
Right. Yeah,
Okay.
we're starting to explore that, and so, I don't know if we're gonna start bringing customers in first, but, definitely some of our SMEs and
Yeah.
start, I guess, crafting it and start
Mhm.
looping in some of the customers.
Yeah. Good. Other questions? Just tired of listening to Rick and want to go home?
These all require certainty in the organization, right?
I'm sorry.
These all, whatever you are doing, it requires certainty in the organization that things will be like this for
Mhm.
certain amount of time.
Yes.
Now, every 3 months or 6 months in financial company, they change.
Yes.
So, does it really work?
I don't think I truly understand the
Because
problem.
in a financial company, you're saying, means you come from financial company.
Yes.
Every 3 months, 6 months, they reorg.
Oh. Well, okay, so organizational structure from an HR perspective versus structure delivery.
That comes down to the.
Yeah.
Right? Because
Well, it's a problem, right? If
that's why I'm asking you, but how do we manage that kind of a, see, any
So-
planning, any project management, whether you Agile or whatever, it requires certain stability in the.
That's right. That's right.
If there is a continuous change, then the whole thing goes.
Yeah, it's disruptive. So I would want to get up under why that's happening. Why does an organization feel compelled to reorg every 3 or 4 or 5, 6 months? Right?
But it's not at your level, it will be at the CEO level, at the, maybe executive, high level. They cannot question them. We are too low. Maybe.
Well. So the thing, if you're truly doing a transformation organization, this is not happening down at the Scrum teams. This is a company transformation from the top all the way down. So we're having those conversations, and so you'd have to have some influence. And a lot of times it's a lack of trust. right? If we can't demonstrate predictability and a stable delivery system, there's people at the top that we have to make a change. But we can demonstrate an approach by using structure, governance, and metrics to allow you to create a delivery system that becomes stable and predictable. And
That's what I'm saying, because, see, even when somebody is delivering and doing the right things, it doesn't matter, because changes happen at the top, they come down and disrupt the whole thing.
yeah, so at a certain level, you can't protect against those, right? But you want to continue working up the organization to create the influence necessary to keep those things from happening, or at least find out why they're happening.
See, my point is, how much you can plan and how much you can look ahead.
Yeah.
Or predict ahead and do the work, rather than try to plan and do for a longer period of time, and it may not work out that way.
My experience is I haven't found most companies having that amount of disruption. That may not be representative of what's out there, but I just haven't experienced it. The organizations I've been experienced tend to be more stable than that. So, other questions? Was this useful?
Very
Okay, awesome.
One more question.
Yes.
Do you have any tools that support this type of project delivery?
In what way? What do you mean
For
tools?
governance, for example.
Yeah, so so there are tools. There's tools in the Agile space that support this. So, if you wanted a Agile lifecycle management tool that supports portfolio management, program management, all the way down to delivery teams, version 1 does it, Rally does it. Jira's made good progress here in the last year in being able to do portfolio management. So there's a number of tools out there that do that. To the point, we've had organizations that use spreadsheets. That works too.
Yes, we will look for a tool that supports current waterfall and the future Agile. Do you have tools that support both? And
That just makes me feel ill.
you have to work your way towards Agile.
Yeah, right. Well, so it gets back to the discussion we had earlier about doing a slice, right? Because if you're doing waterfall, you've got systems in place. And so what we want to do is let's create a slice of the organization that operates in an Agile fashion, tool them up appropriately, show that success, and then as these people move off of waterfall, they're just expanding into that tool set. So buying a tool to try to do both, I don't know that that's the right answer, especially if your eventual journey takes the whole organization to Agile. I don't know. Probably deserves deeper conversation, so,
Thank you.
which I'm welcome to
Jump
have.
off the ledge.
Yeah, right. Any other questions?
Well, I've been in an organization that has both Agile and Waterfall for client implementation, and Agile for product development.
Yep.
So it does cross in the same organization. Some of the same resources
Yep.
are in both types of projects.
Yeah. And it just becomes a project management. It's a planning horizon issue at that point. Because the organization I told you earlier had 17 different parts of the organization that they had dependencies on. All of those parts were waterfall. This part of the organization was Agile. It didn't matter. I don't care if you're waterfall. I just care that you make your commitments. Now, if your lead time's 9 months, that's another problem, right? But
Well, it's waste.
yeah, if you can meet your commitments, then we're good. Okay. Any other questions, thoughts?
So I think you may have already, I think you did touch on this a little bit, but like one of the situations that we have is that we have a pretty tight deadline to get some major modules out as we just converted over to doing a new product. So basically a central warehouse module. It's going to take a long, probably to about June is what we're estimating. So, but we also have things that we're still continuously working on right now. We're getting that customer feedback, and those were like gaps or bugs or just whatever, it may be, new enhancement requests. So we're trying to figure out, like with forecasting, like our velocity, when we can actually project to have this warehouse, the central kitchen actually done, swagging, what we think this thing may possibly be, plus being able to commit to some of these gaps and this customer feedback that's coming in. How do you manage this long-term commitment that we have to get this done. It's, you know, a strategic, part of the strategic theme to meet this deadline on Central Kitchen. But then also we've got all these things that we've pushed out there, and then everybody's like, when are we gonna have it? When are we gonna have it? And then trying to make those commitments without lying.
Well, yeah, so it gets back to understanding your investment mix, right? I'm going to use this chart to just illustrate. I'm going to use this chart for a different purpose. But let's say that 60% of your capacity is focused on that new product development.
Okay.
That gives you a certain amount of capacity, 40% for the other stuff. And so we just have to hold ourselves to that standard. If you have sufficient break fix customer requests coming in to meet that 40%, then manage it that way. If it's only 20%, the rest of your capacity is to this new product development, and just manage it. That means that the flow is pretty even as far as that unplanned work coming in, and maybe you just have to make it so. You know, maybe there's spikes, but your response back to the customer is, this is when you're going to get it. We got it here, but you're going to get it 2 sprints from now, not this sprint, and just manage it that way. Because you should have a good understanding of your velocity, right? It's just, what is your investment of that velocity toward those different categories of work?
Yeah. And right now we do have a team that, we have a couple of new members on the team, so we're like in the storming phase.
Yeah,
We
right.
are increasing.
They're not high performing yet.
Right, and we have increased our velocity. You know, each release, you know, we're seeing that we're inching up there, but we're being held to like trying to get to 120 points based off of these swags. It's all scientific. And
Well, it is a wild ass guess, so, you know, holding me to that commitment.
Swag doesn't sound scientific.
so we're trying to get there, but then so we're also being told like, okay, so if you can't get 120 points, you can't meet this deadline. You need to prove to me why, you know. But we also have all these other things that we're wanting, percentage, a little piece of the pie. And then I'm telling you,
It sounds like you need to call us.
like, so, or do we get more resources? You know, so just basically just trying to leverage, like, how are we going to get it all done?
Yeah. Well, that was the other thing I was going to say. If you know your demand is greater than your capacity, maybe the company has to make an investment.
Yeah.
You know, my bank account doesn't support me buying a Lamborghini. So if I want a Lamborghini, I have to increase my bank account somehow, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess it is really just trying to figure out, like, you know, we're getting there. We do think that we'll get to 120 points, but I don't think that's going to be enough, because that's probably going to be a high-performing, maxed out.
Yeah. Yeah.
With all the little pieces of the pie that have to go
Yeah.
towards other pieces of the
But
development, which I know they don't want to hear that.
It seems to me
but
as if
it's
by
worth
doing this,
figuring out.
and I don't know your problem. I know I don't. But the way you're describing it is like they're just throwing so much at you, you can't get a constant velocity, because it's just being thrown at you the whole time.
Yeah.
Again, it may be a
It's
resource
forecasting
issue.
the future. Like, I was like, if I had a crystal ball, I could tell you, but I don't. So what I can do is based off of history and the chaos that we've had in the past.
Yeah. Well, it sounds to me like there was a belief in a certain throughput that the team had that you haven't obtained, which that's reality. This is what your throughput is. What can we do to improve it? But there were some assumptions made that were wrong.
That was based on a high-performing team that we had a year ago.
Yeah, right.
That no longer exists. That no longer exists.
Okay, yeah, well then, there you go. There you go. That's right. That's right. Yes, well, I had a 350 horsepower engine in this car, and now I'm running with 100 horsepower. And you're expecting the same outcome? Right? Yeah. Yes.
I encountered that same problem with Children's Healthcare. We've got an 8-story building we're building, and they're gonna roll out the floors in pairs to, like that. And they said, oh, the IT guys, they only need 3 weeks to install the software. So we'll do 3 weeks here, then we'll roll out 3 weeks, then we'll roll out 3 weeks. I said, time out. We have a 10-week lead on each one of those. Draw a vertical line. You just killed us.
Yeah, right.
When you have 10, 10, 10, 10 rollout. They're like, oh my God. I said, yeah, that doesn't happen until June of next year.
Right.
We can fix this.
Yeah, right.
But I'm showing him that exactly with what my team can do.
Yeah.
And I said, like I said, do you want a Yugo or a Lamborghini?
Yeah.
Which one? Because we need more people. We need 4 teams instead of 2.
Yeah, right, right, right.
And if we have the 4 teams, we knock
Yeah.
not only that out, but also some nice to have and want to have projects later on, because we'll have that in place. And
Yep.
just do it easy.
Right. Question?
So as far as the percentage of investment, I'm assuming that's the portfolio teams.
Maybe. Typically, it's set at a higher level strategy. So based upon the strategy of the company, here's what we're willing to spend to support those. Typically.
Where we're at right now, we're getting the executive team to take a look at some of the longer projects beyond what we're gonna do
Yeah.
next year. Do we really need to keep these 4 teams together doing what they're doing? And if we do, will they have work to do?
Right.
And keep
Yeah,
them busy.
yeah, right.
But that's where
It's
the
hard to do.
portfolio would fund the stream, the project,
That's
not
that's
the
right.
people.
Well, so it's interesting, right? So a lot of times most organizations walk in, they're very project-based funding. And what we want to do is we want to fund teams. We want to fund capacity and make sure we're picking the right things to do with that capacity. It's a different way of thinking about it, right? And that's a hard one to pivot as well.
Reverse engineering.
Yeah.
You know, some companies like your company does, you know, top-down type work.
Mm-hmm.
Where I see a lot of companies that are trying to go through transformation, trying to do it bottom up.
Mm-hmm.
And so you
Well, we have some of those too.
You have upper management that has no idea
Yeah.
of what they're
Right.
doing, nor do they want to put in resources for
Yeah.
something like automated testing
Mhm.
or you know, or
Yeah.
cloud or whatever.
Right.
So there's that yin-yang type pull all the time.
But even those conversations have to demonstrate value, because the business doesn't care that we're doing automated testing or not. They care about the outcomes, and if we can build a business case that this thing that took us 6 months to build last time you wanted it, if we had invested in automated testing, maybe it would have taken 3 months. So that's a 50% reduction in cost to deliver the same amount of value. So we have to have business discussions about even those technical things.
And you have to have a backlog to make use of that capacity.
That's right. That's right. Right. Anything else? All right, guys. Well, thank you for coming out. Been a good crew.